These computer, let's see, we got that. These computer video chats, they have sort of different frameworks and how you share screens and things like that. So bear with me just for a second as I get us set here. Come on over. I always start with this. My friend Craig Ivani, the director of the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum in Tucson, Arizona, that celebrate indigenous knowledge substantially. This is an image that has, not an image, a painting that his wife Rachel did. So I always start with that. But Joni and Tina, thank you so much for inviting me today to speak with the Buena Vista Audubon. Uh-oh. Hello, sorry.
You're here. You're here.
Okay, good. I just had my whole system just kind of collapsed on me here, but
Oh,
we're going to go like that. Thanks everybody for your patience. But everybody, obviously knowledge in Oceanside. I'm going to share some stories about the Oceanside region, I guess I could say today, of Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge. But what I'm going to do for this talk is talk about the biology and conservation of sea turtles throughout the state of California.
and Jeff, right now we see a small screen and then a bunch of little screens of all your slides. I think you need it in,
Oh,
you need to get it in presentation mode or.
okay. Well, I'm sorry about that, everybody.
It's okay.
I think that technical difficulty just did something here. Let's see. Okay, let's try this again. Joni, if you could tell me again that whole situation of not knowing what program, but can you see that title slide?
There. Now
Okay.
we see the painting.
Perfect. Okay, great. So today I'm going to be talking about biology and conservation of sea turtles in California. I'm going to share a bunch of different stories, not just about the turtles that are here, but why they're here and where they come from. And I think one of the most important things that I'd like to point out is that sea turtles, they're species that they're ancient mariners. They are ocean connectors. They will travel from Japan to California, from Papua New Guinea to California, from various countries. And I want to tell those stories and talk about how just the spatial context of how important Southern California in general is for sea turtles throughout the entire Pacific Ocean. But I want to kind of set the stage to begin with, and let's go back 140 to 65 million years ago. And this is the Archelon. This is one of the, I think, most famous of the sea turtle dinosaurs. And they're giant, obviously. We don't have animals this size today, but if you look at their bone structure, they're virtually unchanged. Sea turtles are today relative to Archelon from years past. And when I talk about the leatherback turtle, which is also called the leathery turtle, that's a species that it's virtually a carbon copy of the same leatherback ancestor that existed 80 million years ago. So they truly are from the Cretaceous period. The same animals that were swimming around the oceans during that time are still swimming around the world today. Another thing that I'd like to point out as I set the stage is that sea turtles are a great example of what I called functional morphology. And you can, whether you're looking at a bird or you're looking at a mammal or a reptile, or in this case, a sea turtle, if you look at its body form, some people call it a bow plan, but if you look at an animal's body form and its shape, you can tell something about how that animal makes its living. And turtles are a perfect example of that. And I encourage you, when you're looking at your birds, look at their beak shape and look at what sort of prey or what foods they eat. And you'll see an incredible match between beak shape with prey, and turtles are an exact example of that. And I'm just going to go clockwise from the upper left here. Loggerhead turtles, and I'll get into the natural history in a moment, but I'd like to point out that loggerhead turtles, in this case, their namesake suggests this loggerhead, like giant head. And why do they have that large head? Well, they happen to be molluscivores and crustacean eaters. So they have this large head, much larger than any other species in terms of relative size of their head to their body. So they have these they can support the musculature to eat those hard-bodied organisms, to be able to crunch those shells, to be able to consume that food. Hawksbill turtles, another species, much again like the namesake, that certainly looks like a avian-like beak to me. And hawksbills actually, they are what we call spongivores, almost exclusively sponge eaters. And so this was thought, the conventional wisdom is that that shape of that beak is such that, and that overhang, that overbite, if you will, is just the perfect tool to bite into large barrel sponges and things that they're consuming. And let's continue with the green turtle in the lower right. And that's my favorite species. I've focused my research on green turtles for many, many years. It's the species that's most common in California. I'll tell those stories in a little bit. Green turtles are, in many areas, they're herbivores. So they're eating seagrass and marine algae. And if you want to be a herbivore and you're eating these leafy greens that grow off the sea floor, you want to have a beak that's scissor-like, so you can snip those pieces of plant material off the sea floor. And if you look at that beak, certainly it looks like scissors to me. And then lastly, the leatherback, the largest of turtles, which is one of our, it's the state marine reptile of California. So that's pretty neat. But they're jellyfish consumers. Sea turtles don't have thumbs. If you're trying to eat a jellyfish and you don't have hands to be able to eat that jellyfish, you have to have some mechanism, some structure, some shape in your body that can help you eat those jellies. And certainly when we look at jelly or look at leatherbacks and that beak with that sort of hook in the front end of the beak, that's an apparatus that's used to be able to grab onto the jelly, to have the jelly not escape as they're eating it. So just I think a good example when we talk about the shape of an animal, you can tell a lot about its life history, about how it makes a living. Another thing to point out with sea turtles is that without a doubt, historically, they were one of the most abundant larger vertebrates in our world's oceans. And this is in the Pacific Ocean. These are green turtles, but you look at the sheer numbers of animals. And let's shift to a terrestrial setting for a moment. And these are olive ridley turtles. This is in Pacific Costa Rica. But olive ridley turtles, just incredible numbers of animals. And when we talk about olive ridleys, of all sea turtles, is that I'd like to focus on their ecological role for a second. And what I mean by that is, like, what is their importance in the ecosystem? What's their importance in the community? Oftentimes people will ask a naturalist or somebody that's interested in wildlife, like, what does it matter if we lose a species? Like, if a species goes extinct, what does it matter? Well, every animal has a role in our ecosystem. And if you pull that animal out, you just start to slowly just erode the foundation of an ecosystem. And with olive ridley turtles, for example, as well as other sea turtle species, so these are the only species that are what we call Arabata nesters, where it's almost a social event where you have thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of turtles coming ashore at the very same time to lay nests. And I'll give a perfect example of that. A place that I worked years ago on the Pacific coast of Mexico, in the state of Oaxaca, at a beach called Escobilla, which happens to be the largest Arabata beach in the world today. And there's probably a dozen Arabata beaches or so. But on that beach in any given year during the full moon tides, 400,000 turtles will come ashore within 3 days. 400,000 turtles within 3 days in 7 kilometers of beach, just over 3 miles of beach. So we're talking just incredible numbers of animals. And when they're coming ashore, each individual is laying a nest of eggs in the sand that weighs roughly 8 to 12 pounds. And that is all egg material that has nutrients that is from the ocean ecosystem that they've been able to stock into their body from foraging in those ocean habitats. And they come to shore and those eggs are laid in the sand. Many of them hatch, many of them don't. And those that don't provide that nutrients, they're almost a spark plug for coastal terrestrial ecosystem productivity. And green turtles and olive ridley turtles, they're what we are known as marine subsidizers. So they provide subsidies to the terrestrial habitat and help the terrestrial productivity. Another thing I'll point out about ecological roles of, let's say, green turtles, and why are green turtles important? Well, they're particularly important for productivity as well, but in a slightly different way. And we'll also call these animals ecosystem regulators or ecosystem engineers. And with green turtles, and I'll focus on it a little bit later today for San Diego, for example. We have expansive seagrass habitats, something called eelgrass, Zosta marina. And in those habitats, green turtles forage on those seagrasses. And by consuming those foods and digesting, and they have kind of like cows, they have an end gut endosymbiont, so they can digest the cellulose. They're able to eat seagrass, process it, poop it out, and make all the nutrients that were sequestered in that blade of grass available for the marine community. And that happens in a matter of hours to a couple of days. Whereas if green turtles aren't there, seagrass habitats have this incredible way of sequestering nutrients. They grow, their blades grow, they take in all this nitrogen, all this phosphorus, all this carbon, and it just sits there. And unless an animal comes along to consume and release those nutrients, it will sit there for a very long period of time. And so green turtles have this way, it's called short circuiting of the nutrient cycle. They're able to sort of spark plug the marine productivity in the coastal areas where they occur. To switch gears for a moment, I think for me, more and more, I have great appreciation, and Tina, I really appreciate your opening today, but the cultural significance of sea turtles throughout the world. And the examples that I have, and let me step back and say, so I've, as Joni pointed out, my first year working with turtles was in 1986 at a nesting beach called Tortuguero in Costa Rica. And since then, since 1992, for example, I've worked in Mexico, and there are incredible deep cultures, both from indigenous tribes as well as native, as well as Mexican cultures that have incredible appreciation for sea turtles. And one of those groups is the Comcac of Sonora, formerly known as the Seri. That's the Anglo term that has been applied to them. But the Comcac believe that leatherback turtles are their ancestors. And actually that they live on the back of a turtle, sort of figuratively. But with leatherbacks, what they do historically is they would capture animals, or they'd actually sing them to shore, as the old tales go. They'd adorn them with native pigmentation, these paints. They'd have a 4-day ceremony, and then they'd release that animal back into the water. And that was sort of their origin story. If we transfer it to today, even for all of us, if any of us have seen turtles in the wild, we all probably remember that first time we saw that animal, and we think very fondly of it. And that's one of the things with turtles. They're sort of the poster child for what we call charismatic megafauna. So they just have this charisma, the Discovery Channel, the feel-good stories on any of the news feeds that we get. Turtles feature not rarely. So they're a lot of times, and we just remember those times a lot. Unfortunately, when we talk about sea turtles, we also talk about human exploitation. And so this is back at, as a matter of fact, back at the very same beach adjacent to that Escobilla, Oaxaca beach, where tens, if not hundreds of thousands of turtles have been harvested over the years. And unfortunately, with changing ethic through much of the world, the use of sea turtle products for food purposes has diminished substantially. Just the culture has changed, that not as many people eat turtles, which is good. But we're still dealing with the consequences of decades of harvest. And so my career, my job has been dedicated to try and recover sea turtles, green turtles, and other species here in the Eastern Pacific Ocean. A lot of it involves people. In this case, this would be working with local fishers, with local families, trying to explain to them the importance of protecting species. But it's also working with fishers. And one of the biggest problems currently is what we call bycatch, or incidental capture or accidental capture of turtles when fishers are putting hooks or nets in the water trying to catch their target species. And I want to say briefly, just to point out that there is a narrative in the world that talks about how fishers are bad, that they kill these endangered species. And I will tell you that that's a narrative that is really vilifying people that are just trying to make a living and trying to feed their families. And so I think it's really important, before we pass judgment on any impacts that happen to endangered species, as much as we love those animals and as much as we hate to see them die, is put ourselves in the shoes of people that live in those communities that have hungry kids or trying to feed their family. And so the issue of sea turtle conservation and protection, it's a deep cultural issue, a social issue that has no simple silver bullet fix. It takes a lot of time and trust and working with people from around the world to try and protect these species. Currently, when we talk about conservation, we've expanded a lot from even 15, 20 years ago. So in the early years of sea turtle conservation, it was all focused on nesting beaches. Females come ashore to nest, they lay their eggs, they're very user-friendly for scientists to come out and take blood or manipulate the animal or put a tracking device on the top of them, and then the animals will go back in the water. But in my career, so it really sort of officially started as a sea turtle scientist in 1993, and pretty much everybody's doing nesting beach work. And the work that myself and colleagues started to do was in the water, trying to understand the ecology of turtles as they live in their native habitat, not when they're nesting, but when they're in their areas where they live most of the time. They're trying to gain resources to be able to at some point reach maturity or to nest. And so the idea of focusing on nesting beaches and foraging areas is really, really important. This is myself and a colleague, Tomo Oguchi, releasing a loggerhead turtle with a small satellite tagged on it in the Southern California Bight, just off of Catalina Island, about just pre-COVID, I'd say. So great photo that my friend Ralph took. So let's focus on just the species diversity. And I'm talking to a lot of ornithologists and birders, and I'm sorry, but sea turtles don't have nearly as a species diversity as birds. And we only have 7 species. Some people will say 7.5 species. But they have incredible life history and are extremely interesting in and of themselves. But the species that we have is the leatherback turtle. It's the largest turtle. They occur in very cool climates. They have quasi-warm-blooded systems, so they can get into those cold waters. They're a California turtle I'll talk about a little bit later. We have flatback turtles. This is what we call an Australian endemic. An endemic animal is an animal that only lives in that particular spot, and flatback turtles only live in Australia, which is very interesting. We have loggerhead turtles. I'll tell stories today about loggerheads that occur in Southern California in particular. You heard about the hawksbills earlier. With that beak that's shaped, that functional morphology, we can tell what they eat based on the way they're shaped. Spongivores. We have the olive ridley, which is that species that is a great example of the providing marine subsidies to terrestrial ecosystems. And interestingly, though it's not in our part of the world, but on the East Coast, and particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, is the sister species to the olive ridley, and it's called a Kemp's ridley turtle. And when scientists use what's called a biological clock and they look at the mutation rate through time, we can pinpoint when the olive ridley and the Kemp's ridley common ancestor diverged. And it happens to be right at the closing of the Isthmus of Panama, which one might expect. And then finally, the green turtle. And this is that sort of 7.5 species. We have green turtles that occur around the world that look more or less similar to one another. And then we have this thing called the black turtle, or the East Pacific green turtle, that occurs in our part of the world, in the Eastern Pacific. And when I say Eastern Pacific, I'm talking about the Pacific coast of the Americas, roughly from Alaska to Chile, essentially. And for green turtles, they're occurring from Southern California to Northern Chile. And the black turtle, it's a unique form. That's the species that occurs in our local waters. They just have really interesting ecology that I'll focus on in a little bit. But when we talk about turtles in California, I think and I mentioned earlier, I sort of let the cat out of the bag of just how many countries are of origin for turtles occurring in our waters. But why do they come here? Well, they come to our waters of California because we have incredibly productive marine ecosystems. We have incredible coastal upwelling that brings cold, nutrient-rich waters to the surface that provides a spark plug for salps and pyrosomes and dinoflagellates and all sorts of different animals in the marine community. That's the extreme productivity. We have the El Nino and the La Nina cycle. We're cycling out of the El Nino right now. It sounds like we're going to go into a La Nina cycle here this summer. So from just two opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of that El Nino cycle. But what that does is you'll have some incredibly warm years, some incredibly cold years in terms of water temperature, some years with incredible amounts of rain, other years that are super dry. And that sort of keeps the system in flux. And so the Eastern Pacific, and particularly the California current, is an area that it's not the same from year to year. And we even see that from our local weather. I mean, this year versus last year versus the year before, those are 3 different years in terms of the rain patterns and the weather patterns. So the turtles experience the same sort of thing. When we talk about the marine protected areas in California, or why, besides productivity, it's good to be here. Well, it's good to be here because we have large protected areas that are preventing the impact of marine fisheries on turtles. And so one of those areas is called the Pacific Leatherback Conservation Area. It's from northern Oregon to just south of the opening of Monterey Bay. It's closed every year from August 15th to November 15th for one of the most productive, highest grossing revenue fisheries in California. It's the swordfish fishery. So that fishery in the most productive area is closed during the most productive times to prevent impacts with leatherback turtles. And that's every year. So what we call that is a static closure, like every year on the clock, it's just opening and closing as you go. And then we have another closure area. It's called the Loggerhead closure area, pardon me. And that's in Southern California. And this is something we call a dynamic closure. And it occurs during warm periods. So those El Nino periods, or when there's a big influx of animals into loggerheads into Southern California, that's when the National Marine Fisheries Service, the organization that I work for, will close that habitat to fishing for swordfish. And then you stack on top of that is I won't get into too much, but we have declared critical habitat for leatherbacks off the coast, the Pacific coast of America is a big patch that's in California. We're working on green turtle critical habitat right now. NOAA is to protect additional habitat. So if you're a turtle coming from any of these different countries of origin, when you get to California, you're relatively safe. That bycatch that I spoke of earlier, that is a big impact around the world, probably the biggest impact, is not such a problem in California. And that's something we should be very proud of. Both our federal and our state fisheries management agencies have done a really good job to minimize impacts. So what I want to do now is tell 3 stories, and I'm going to shift and start talking about leatherback turtles. But I'm going to talk about 3 species that I consider like they are the quintessential California sea turtles. The first is the leatherback. I mentioned earlier it's the largest. They get to be about 6 feet long, about 1,500 pounds or so. It's the largest ones. They're jelly consumers. So they're eating, whether the top there, that's what we call a sea nettle, the middle jelly, much like it looks, it's called an egg yolk jelly, and the bottom jelly is called a moon jelly. But those are the 3 primary species for leatherbacks. And during those periods of incredible upwelling that we talked about, and particularly in Central California, it attracts leatherbacks. It's like a magnet. They come in and they just forage and they tank up. They just fill up with food so that they can go back to the Western Pacific and reproduce again. One of the, to me, really neat things about leatherbacks is that I believe that like their hatchlings, they're like mini-me's. It's like this carbon copy of the adult. And they're unique to any other sea turtle species. Number one, they don't have a hard shell. So that the leatherback, as I said earlier, the leathery turtle, it's because they have this leathery type shell. But these hatchlings, they come out and they're about 8 ounces. They're about the weight of a Kit Kat bar, if you were to buy a Kit Kat bar. And they have these giant front flippers. So the second that they hit the water, they're ready to swim. They can dive. They can eat small, soft-bodied prey as soon as they hit the water. Whereas the other hard shell hatchlings, they're much smaller, not nearly as developed, and they have to be floaters, essentially, and they're tied to the surface, and it makes them very susceptible to predation. But leatherbacks, this mini-me animal, I challenge anybody outside of the marsupial family, kangaroos in particular, that has such a disparity in the size of the adult, let's say 1,500 pounds, versus a hatchling, which is 8 ounces. Just an incredible story in the animal, the story of animal diversity. I spoke a little bit earlier about their beak and that sort of hook on the front of the beak, but they also have in their throat, they have these jagged spikes that are pointing down their throat. So as they start to eat the jellies, again, they don't have thumbs. So how can I get this soft-bodied sort of gelatinous prey thing down my gullet? Well, I have to have these different appendages, both in my mouth and in my throat, to be able to consume those items. And when we talk about that marine productivity in California, this is a really good example of it. These are moon jellies off the Farallon Islands. My colleague, local leatherback expert, Scott Benson, would say this is in biblical proportions. You can walk across the water on jellies. I'd say he's not too far off. But when we talk about where this upwelling occurs, when we talk about where the leatherbacks occur, I'll just focus on a map. And it shows leatherback occurrence in the hot spots in California, but it also shows the technique, the primary technique we use to study turtles and the leatherbacks in California. So you can see off in Monterey Bay, off the San Francisco Bay coast, out to the Farallon Islands, we use what's called a twin turboprop twin otter. That is the aircraft for aerial surveys that we do. And a lot of our work is focusing on flying around looking for marine mammals in some cases, but usually turtles, to get an understanding of their distribution and their density. Because if we know where they are and where are the hot spots, we can be much better equipped to design strategies to protect those animals. Another component of our research, however, is not just flying to count the animals, and they spend time at the surface, they're very obvious when you see them, but we also catch these turtles. And so we'll use that aircraft when the aircraft is not counting animals. And when you're doing aerial surveys, you do what's called a transect. So you're kind of mowing the lawn, going back and forth in an area, looking for animals in a very systematic way. But we also use that aircraft to capture turtles. And when we do that, what we'll do is we'll be at the boat. And this is the San Jose State University's boat. It's called the Sheila B. That's my friend Scott I mentioned earlier with the net in his hand there. We'll use the plane. The plane will guide us into the turtles because the turtles are occurring throughout a large area. You saw from Monterey Bay to Farallon Islands, essentially. But we'll use the plane to guide us in. We'll catch it with that net, and we'll bring those animals to the deck. This gives a little bit of an idea of the size of this turtle. So 607 kilos. I'd say that's about close to 1,300 pounds. This is 2007, but it's just an old photo. I keep this photo because it's one of my favorites. It just really exemplifies how big these animals are. But we still, every year we go out and we're doing the same capture work. When we're doing this work, from the planes, we're trying to get an understanding of where they are and how many. From the boats, we're trying to figure out why are they there and what are they doing there? What are they foraging on? What's their daily strategy? And so oftentimes we'll equip them with a pop-off camera that gets stuck on the turtle with a suction cup. And again, these are jellyfish consumers. And I'll give you, this is kind of, it's a little bit dated footage. I acknowledge that it's grainy, but it kind of gives the flavor of, this is a leatherback off in Monterey Bay at the time. These are sea nettles, Chrysura fuscescens. That animal is just moving around the water looking for sea nettles. And jellies, they occur in huge numbers. The turtles are not eating the entire jelly. What they're eating are those, what they're called the oral arms and the gonads. So everything outside of the bell, that top piece, that pulsating piece, the red color, that part, they're not eating that. It's just the gonads, that fluffy cotton candy looking things. And why are they doing that? Because that's the most nutrient-rich portion of those animals. Let me just show that one more time so everybody can take a look. But what these leatherbacks do is they encounter what we call prey fields of incredible density. And in those areas, they basically are trying to eat as much as they can in as quick a time as possible as they can. Another aspect that we do when we catch these turtles is we equip them with small transmitters. We call these satellite tags. It's a very small tag on it relative to the size of that animal. And with that tag, it sends a signal to global orbiting satellites. And on my email each day, I'll get the location of where a particularly tagged turtle is. And to give you an idea of leatherback turtles, so these are close to 250 tagged animals. And what I want to point out here is there's two things. Well, first of all, you can see that California connection. The light green and the dark green tracks, those are all tracked turtles between California and the Solomon Islands and Indonesia. But the other part of this too is that there's this incredible separation between two distinct populations, or sometimes we call them stocks of leatherback turtles in the Pacific. You have this what we call the Western Pacific leatherback stock. Those are the animals that are nesting in the Western Pacific, in Papua New Guinea, and in Indonesia and the Solomon Islands. And then you have what's called the Eastern Pacific stock that are the animals that are nesting on the tip of Baja all the way down to Pacific Costa Rica. So these two different groups. And for as amazing of animals as they are, sadly, there are species that probably today is the most endangered sea turtle species in the world. They're so unique, so incredible, but they also have been incredibly susceptible to marine fisheries bycatch. And this is just a quick example of just how the populations have declined over time. A lot of times as a marine turtle scientist, we'll look at population trends, and what you're looking at right now is each of those lines represents a different population, and it's the numbers of nests is how high the line is, and as you go from the left to the right, those are the sequence through years, and you can see how those populations have just declined through time. And so that's a lot of what I do, is trying to protect leatherback turtles. And one of the aspects that is the sort of the culprit these days for leatherbacks, And again, California is a very safe place for turtles, but one of the threats is the Dungeness crab fishery. And you may have noticed, well, first of all, let me point out that the Dungeness crab fishery is also a big culprit for whale, particularly humpback whale entanglement. Dungeness crab in California, the prices have absolutely skyrocketed. The reason they've skyrocketed is because there's more and more whales that just through the regime shifts, humpbacks are occurring in our waters more and more frequently for longer periods of time. And so the state, this is a state fishery, the Dungeness crab, the season gets pushed back for the open date farther and farther, waiting for the whales to leave because we don't want to kill the whales. And so what happens with that is you have fewer Dungeness crab because the season is shorter. And so that price goes up and up. But the other thing I'll point out for leatherbacks is that it is the California state marine reptile. I think I mentioned that earlier. And they're just a species that we should be very proud of to be in California and know how important they are for our state and also for the ecosystem. And then just a final example, this is from a colleague of mine, Brian Scare. This appeared in National Geographic magazine a number of years ago, but that's a giant pyrosome that leatherback is consuming. So moving on, I want to now shift gears and tell a story about loggerhead turtles. And we're moving now from leatherbacks, that leathery shelled animal, to the hard-shelled, sort of the characteristic animal that you'd think of. Tina talked about western pond turtles earlier, like freshwater turtles. They have that hard shell, much like the hard-shelled sea turtles. And loggerheads are just an incredible example of that. It's a species that occurs throughout the North Pacific. And we call this figure a spaghetti plot. And it's called a spaghetti plot. I think you can figure out why, but what it is about 300 loggerhead turtle satellite tracks. And satellite telemetry, putting these tags on the backs of animals, is a great way for us to understand their movements and their connectivity. What nations or what bodies of water they connect. And when you put enough of them out like this, close to 300, you get a great sense of the distribution of the species within a particular area. So loggerhead turtles, they nest in Japan. The animals hit the open ocean as hatchlings. They'll live for many, many years in the central North Pacific in the high seas. And one of the neat things with loggerheads is that they're very tied to temperature. Now, what I'm going to show you now is this is a map of sea surface temperature. And in the Pacific, and the warmer colors, the purples and the blues, that's the cold water. The greens and the oranges are the warmer water. And as seasons progress, during summer periods, the warm water goes farther north. And as the winter comes, that warm water recedes back towards the equator. And if you look at those different colors and you look at and I'll start this just again right here, but you can see that these loggerhead turtles, these are satellite tracks, they're absolutely tracking the temperature of the water as they go. So they really focus on temperature. And they do that both for maintaining the optimal body temperature, but also because they know that that's where the prey occurs. So they're following the prey. Well, one of the things is that if we know that loggerheads are so tied to temperature, and we know that bycatch is a problem, meaning that they're getting accidentally captured by swordfish and tuna fisheries, that we can have some predictive power to tell fishers where loggerheads are probably going to occur. And there's a tool called Turtle Watch that NOAA has. This is for the Hawaii-based longline fishery, but fishers log in every day to this site to figure out where to not catch turtles, because fishers don't want to catch turtles. It costs hooks, it costs time, it's money. And so the more endangered species they interact with, the worse off they are. So they don't want to catch turtles. They want to have a tool like this. And this is a great example of how National Marine Fisheries Service, the organization I work for, how we work with fishers closely to be able to have them stay on the water and make a living and not impact endangered species. For us, focusing on loggerhead turtles, and actually in water research, much like with the leatherbacks, we've only been doing it for a relatively short period of time, since 2014. And the reason for that is in 2014 was the most recent prior to the sort of weak El Nino that we have this year. But in 2014-15, we had what we call a mega Nino. It was an intense El Nino. And in Southern California, off our waters, we had just all sorts of crazy species that normally are not here. Whether it's a wahoo, I'll go clockwise, a wahoo or the pelagic red crabs or bluefin tuna or a yellow-bellied sea snake, loggerhead turtles. mahi-mahi or dolphin fish they're called, or mola mola, the sunfish, they all occurred in our waters. It was like tropical paradise off the coast of California, of Southern California back in 2014, 2015, and a huge influx of loggerhead turtles. And so with our agency, remember that we do those aerial surveys. A lot of what we do is try to figure out how many there are and where they are. Well, we, in 2015, conducted an aerial survey. And that aerial survey, we were looking for animals. They're all about this size. This is me back then with less gray hair. But in those surveys, it gives you an example. So let's focus on the right half of that screen for a moment. We counted about 400 turtles. And that, when we did the math, because a lot of turtles are underwater, you can't tell that they're there or not. You certainly can't see them from the air. But our mathematics and our modeling, we estimated that there were about 14 to 15,000 turtles occurring in and around the Channel Islands and offshore the Channel Islands in the Southern California Bight. But interestingly, and I remember I talked about how loggerheads are so tied into temperature, they have to have that warm water. When it's a normal year in California, like 2011 was, when we did another aerial survey, we did not see a single turtle. So unlike leatherbacks, which are here every year, and unlike green turtles, which I'll talk about next, which are here every year, loggerheads only occur on occasion when it's really warm water. And it just so happens where this year, it's been a relatively weak El Nino, but we're still seeing animals to some extent. So it's following the pattern. And then lastly, they are interacting with fisheries, not that much. But one of the things that we do with NOAA, it's not quite that turtle watch model like we have in Hawaii, but there's a website that fishers can go to and understand the probability of interactions with animals based on what the water temperature is and what the season is. So I want to close today and tell my final story, and that's about green turtles. And that's a species that, to me, it's I've worked with all 7 species, but I think I'd have to say that my life has been dedicated to the protection and recovery of green turtles more than any other species. So it's a really amazing success story that I'm going to share right now. But let's first set the table and talk about the ecology of animals of green turtles in California. Most places around the world, they're omnivores, or pardon me, they're herbivores eating nothing but seagrass and marine algae. It just so happens in California, they eat all sorts of things, like red algae here in this photo that my friend Ted took in La Jolla Cove. They get pretty large, not like leatherback size, but still pretty big. This is her name was Wrinklebutt, affectionately named for her strange shell, this strange shape of her shell. But she was 540 pounds. We know she was a female. We had done the genetics and we had done the testosterone measurements on her, so she knew she was a female. But when we think about green turtles outside of San Diego and really in general for the species, as I want to say, they're basically the cows of the sea. There's so many animals historically, and as I'll share in a moment presently. But they're essentially, when you think about their ecosystem role, they're lawnmowers with flippers. And so they're perfectly equipped for eating nothing but marine algae or seagrass. They have that beak that we talked about earlier, that sort of incisiform we'll call, or that scissor-shaped beak. They also have an incredibly long gut, with what we call hindgut microbial fermentation that helps degrade the cellulose, the plant cell wall, so they can digest that. I spoke a little bit earlier about the fact that they are these ecosystem engineers, and they're the spark plugs because they can eat foods, and the short circuiting of the detritus cycle, where they can make those nutrients that would just sit there wasting away in the seagrass, make it available to coastal consumers much more quickly. But what's super cool about these animals is that they maintain what are called grazing pastures. And so they know, green turtles, that the fresh shoots that are growing have less cellulose. They're able to, it's more easily digested. And green turtles, even in San Diego Bay, they maintain these particular grazing plots that animals go back to time and again. So the right side of this photo I'll focus on. A couple other interesting facts with green turtles before I talk about them in San Diego is that they're the only basking turtle, probably for thermoregulation, maybe for predator avoidance. So they'll crawl out of the water on islands, particularly where no people are. They also are the species that has this very unsightly tumor. It's called fibropapilloma, largely in Florida and Hawaii. Thankfully, this disease is starting to decline. But when we talk about green turtles around the world, there's just so many different shapes, different sizes, different colors. And when we focus on the Pacific, and I'm going to get, if you look at the rightmost side, this is that prototypical black turtle. That's the animal that's very dark in coloration, has a little bit of a different ecology versus those animals in the Western Pacific or Central Pacific, Hawaii. And when we talk about, we're focusing in now, we're getting closer and closer to our California areas. But the California green turtles, it's what's called the East Pacific green turtle. That gives you a little bit of the range. The big red dots are the big nesting areas, and the yellow dots are the smaller nesting areas. The population, as I talked about earlier, with all sea turtles, it was hammered by directed harvest for food consumption, but it's an incredible success story. From what happened in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s has subsided. People don't eat green turtles as much. This is, again, one of these figures that's showing how the population has increased as time goes by. We're now at a stage where the number of animals for green turtles in the Eastern Pacific is about what it was in the mid-1960s, perhaps more. On those nesting beaches at each morning when you go by, it's almost like tractor tires everywhere. There's almost literally no spot of beach that's untouched by a green turtle that's gone over that's nesting. These days, it's this is in Michoacan, Mexico, about 1,000 females a night will come up to nest. And when you see that recovery at the nesting beaches, it only stands to reason that you also are seeing animals in all new sorts of places in our waters. And so when you talk about California, whether it's tourmaline, sort of Bolsa Chica, Newport, La Jolla, Southeast Alaska, Catalina Island, green turtles are popping up everywhere. But let me focus on San Diego Bay for a moment. And the reason I'll focus on it is because it's what we call a legacy project for NOAA. It's a place we've worked at since 1990. It's incredible seagrass pastures. It's actually an area that we thought originally, there's some speculation that this population was seeded from escaped turtles that were back in the 1800s and early 1900s. Animals boated up from Mexico to supply the soup market and the turtle meat market in Southern and Central California. But in San Diego Bay, what we've seen is an incredible explosion of the numbers of turtles that are occurring there. And so last year, on April 27th, we had a record day. We caught 13 turtles in less than an hour and a half. Well, that's for everybody. For us, that's huge to get that many animals. And it's just that a lot of them are small. So we have these new recruits or these neophytes that are recently hatched from the nesting beach protection. So they're occurring in our waters. We are benefiting here in our coast of what's happening in Mexico in terms of protection. But the turtles that occur in California, let's just focus on a table for a second. So when they come to California, they stay. And usually they'll show up as juveniles, so young animals, and they'll stay until they become adults. And even after adulthood, even after they migrate back to the nesting beaches to nest, they come back to San Diego. And this is just in the last year of 4 examples of turtles that we caught in San Diego Bay that we tagged previously. One turtle we first tagged in 2002, one in 1997, one in 1990. We have a capture history of 33 years for that animal in San Diego Bay. I mean, these are incredible histories of individual turtles that are occurring in our coastal waters. And again, I'm super proud that there's management that's happening right now that allows these turtles to survive in our waters for 3+ decades. They're coming from a bunch of different spots, whether it's the Revillagigedo Islands offshore Mexico or the mainland Mexico. And they're popping up in other spots in San Diego County. And I'll just briefly, I've got about 2 or 3 minutes left, and I'll wrap it up here. But La Jolla Shores, I think, is one of the neatest examples. Any snorkelers out there, if you've had an opportunity. Oh, if everybody could mute. I see an iPhone 12 there, so thank you very much. But La Jolla Shores is a spot that we have turtles, a resident population. We realized years ago that the public is incredibly interested in helping out scientists and providing information. We call it citizen or community science. And my colleague Megan Hanna recognized, and that's this particular spot in the cove, but she realized there's all these divers and snorkelers and paddleboarders and kayakers that are in La Jolla Cove taking photos. And so we implemented a type of artificial intelligence, facial recognition software that we were able to use to identify individual turtles in this area. And we're still tracking those animals today. And so you can actually, there's these things called chips where you're able to identify based on the scale patterns of those animals where they are. And so one of the things, just to close, is I do want to talk about how each of you can be really helpful in what we're doing for our science. And we call it community science. So community members are able to, the public is able to help scientists in what we do. And we have a sightings app. And Joni and Tina, I'd love to send you an email if you could distribute it to your to the whole membership. If you ever see a turtle, it's an app that you can just scan a QR code with your phone, or you can just go on the app and identify where animals are. But we're seeing turtles in the craziest of places, in these little nooks and crannies, 5 and 10 miles from the coast. Green turtles are very curious. They go into all sorts of spots, but this gives you an example. On the other side of the 405 out near Newport, we're seeing green turtles in those areas. And of course, they're exposed to all sorts of threats, much like turtles elsewhere. And one of those biggest threats is boat strikes. With all the watercraft in our area and the increasing numbers of green turtles in our habitats, certainly that human-turtle interaction is increasing. But thanks to folks like Sabrina Mashburn with SoCal Sea Turtles Inc., we're trying to get signs up in many, many more places to try and slow those boats, to minimize those human-turtle interactions or those boat strikes. And again, trying to recover the population. So I'm hopeful that with the stories today, one of the things is that just how important California is for our entire Pacific Ocean. It's a home for turtles that are literally from throughout the Pacific. And when we're in these coastal waters, whether it's the science that we're doing or the management that's happening at the state or the federal level, or our communities, whether it's through citizen science, the community science, and helping us understand where turtles are and when turtles are there, it's really all these different pieces fit together to help us recover these populations for the long term. And I hope with today, I just gave some examples in the short period of time of kind of what's happening in our waters in terms of sea turtles. And I'll stop there and just say, and I'll stop sharing my screen in just a moment here. But again, want to take this opportunity to thank the Buena Vista Audubon Society and Joni and Tina in particular for inviting me today. As I've been doing since I was literally a teenager, I love to talk turtles, and you guys gave me another excuse today. So thanks so much. I appreciate that.
That was a great talk. I could listen to you talk about turtles all night long. Before I was obsessed with birds, I was obsessed with turtles. So
many of us have been. Many of us have been. It's just a totem for a lot of us.
Yeah, this is great. Yeah, we do have some questions. So one question is for the green turtles that tend to be visiting our shores in California, where do they nest? Would it be in Mexico then?
Yeah, so there's so the green turtles that occur in California, there's 2 categories of nesting areas. One category is what we call the insular nesters, the animals that are nesting on the islands offshore of Mexico. So there's 2 archipelagos off the Pacific coast of Mexico. One is called the Revillagigedos. Try and say that 10 times fast. It's impossible. But it's a site like for divers, you might have heard of Socorro Island or Clarion Island. That's one of the areas. And then another spot called the Tres Marias. And those are the insular nesters, but we also have mainland nesters. And the biggest population is this mainland nesting group. I showed the photo earlier of all the tractor tire looking tracks. That's in the state of Michoacan at a beach called Colola. So those are the primary sites. And green turtles here in our waters are all coming from Mexico.
And we did have a question specifically about that site, the Colola site.
Sure.
Does the Mexican government protect it?
As a matter of, so the Mexican government for nesting beach protection, they do a fantastic job. There's a lot of federally managed sites. That beach, Colola Beach, as a matter of fact, however, it is managed by the University of Michoacan. So that's a university nesting beach, a university managed nesting beach. But when I talked about on that last slide, that society, the social component, one of the things, whether it's trying to work with fishers to reduce impacts or working with local communities to have them have stewardship over their own resources, Colola is a site that today is largely managed by the local community. So the university group that started in 1978, that was primarily front and center, they've kind of tried to hand the reins over and they've backed off. And then the local communities are doing all the management now and doing a great job at it.
Oh, that's great. So we've been working on restoring the Buena Vista Lagoon, and one of the questions is how wide and deep of a channel is needed for the turtles to come inside, and is there any possibility they might come inside our lagoon?
Absolutely. They not if, it's when, if not already. And the reason for that is like a little bit to the south, Bataquitos Lagoon, if anybody knows where that is, that's just where the train tracks are. It has a little bitty mouth that might be, I don't know, 10 meters across sometimes, or might be a little bit wider than that, but it's a small indescript lagoon on the coast, north of Carlsbad, and there's turtles in there. And so if there's turtles in there, there's turtles pretty much in any lagoon along our coast. As long as there's an opening and the turtles can get in, they're going to poke around. And again, I just showed the example earlier of turtles on the east side of the 405. So if they're going up there, they're definitely going to the lagoons in your guys' backyard.
Right. And you showed quite a few pictures of them eating the jellies. How is it that they avoid getting stung?
Yeah, so the nematocysts on jellies, they are not robust enough to penetrate the sort of calcified skin, if you will, with leatherbacks in their throats. They've just used, if you eat nothing but jellies and you get stung with jellies time and time again through time, you're going to eventually evolve to have a very robust tissue in your throat so that those nematocysts, those stingers aren't going to bother you. And that's the case with the leatherback turtles.
Oh, okay. And then there was a follow-up question. How the heck do the turtles get inland in Irvine?
Beats me.
Following a little tributary or something, I guess, huh?
Well, actually, this, Johnny, this goes back to one of your earlier questions about how big and how big is the opening, how deep. I think water needs to be no more than about 1.5 feet deep for a sea turtle to go explore that area. Extremely shallow. And I'll give you one example again. But today I still have my field clothes on, everybody. Otherwise, I'd like have a collared shirt and stuff. But I was doing capture work today up in Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge, and one of my colleagues, Justin Greenman, who works for NOAA up in Long Beach, he was telling the story of one of our hot spots right now. It's like one of the biggest conservation challenges is the green turtle explosion in the San Gabriel River. And the San Gabriel River is calling it a river is that's very generous, but it is a sort of highly industrialized. There's these once through the cooling power plants and stuff, but about 1.5 miles from Anaheim Bay, that river, which has a natural bottom, turns into a concrete culvert. And that culvert goes way up towards the San Gabriel Mountains. And think of a culvert, everybody, I always equate it to, if you know the movie Grease, when they're driving around in those old 50s, whatever vehicles, and they're driving up on the sides and stuff, that's the culvert. And that's basically what the San Gabriel River is. But there's a little bitty channel that's about 1.5 feet deep. And just last week, they saw a green turtle that was 4 miles up the concrete channel. So these turtles can go, I mean, they're just curious creatures and they'll go anywhere. And when they're up there, they're not swimming, they're more crawling. They'll use their buoyancy of their body, and they literally like crawl along because their shell is like probably half out of the water, and they're just using that buoyancy to crawl. So just almost, well, they are reptiles, but I was going to say reptilian, more like a lizard or something like that that's crawling along.
Wow. In the slide about loggerheads tending to stay in the warmest Pacific waters, I noticed all the dots were very near the northern margin of the warm region. Is there a reason for that?
Yes. So that spot that they were following. So when you look at ocean temperatures, and if you look at that map, those different colors, those indicated temperatures that were like 15 degrees, 16, 17, 18, 19. And I think that as a scientist, I typically think in Celsius, but in centigrade, that would be like 58, 62, 64, 70 degrees, that range. And it just so happens that at that 18-degree isotherm, that's an area where a lot of invertebrate prey perform the greatest in terms of their metabolism at 18 degrees C. And so prey tend to stack up at that spot, at that temperature. And so the loggerheads are trying to, they're tracking the prey at that temperature.
Oh, I see. I think that's all I'm seeing in the chat. Does anybody else have any questions that we didn't answer already?
Well, thanks again, everybody. I sure appreciate the opportunity to speak today. Joni, again, I really do want to make a plug for that community science tool that we have. So I'll send that to you tomorrow. I'm probably going to sign off after this and I won't be back online tonight, but I'll send that to you tomorrow. If you don't mind, if you could distribute it to everybody, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure, I will send that out when we send the recording. That would be great.
Terrific.
Yeah,
Okay,
we
great.
really appreciate that. My son's a sailor. He's been out with all the orcas and everything. And he takes his iPad and he just puts it down on the water and he can record all kinds of stuff. It's in a waterproof thing. It's amazing the quality he gets. He's got a float on the back and it's in a bag.
Thank you, John.
Yeah. Well,
You
thank
mentioned-
you. I love this.
Sure. You mentioned, just as a side, you mentioned orcas. I wonder if everybody heard about the pod of orcas that swam right along our coast a couple weeks ago from basically like north of Torrey Pines down into La Jolla shores, eating dolphins as they went, swimming right next to swimmers in La Jolla Cove, and then moved south. Pretty crazy, amazing story.
One thing he mentioned, there are rules about orcas up by Seattle, but because they're not usually here, there aren't so many rules. And the fishermen, I mean, the people that are taking people out on boats would really like some rules because they are seeing some boats. And that's one thing. We need rules. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was a really, really wonderful evening. We learned a lot, and we look forward to getting the app from you so that we can distribute that out and hopefully contribute to the science.
Thank you so much, everybody. You all have a great evening.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.